Hello and welcome. First time I'm trying well, actually it's not the first time, but I wanted to check whether or not it's possible to do some kind of live stream. And I possibly screwed up everything in the setup. I tried a few times and thought, no, this can't be right. And then I tried another time, and I'm not I'm not used to setting up these kinds of live streams. So I thought that when I hooked it up, I'm using StreamYard, as you can see. I thought that when it connects to YouTube, there would be some kind of video that there would be a sort of announcing that at this point in time in the future there will be this video streaming. So I can access something on YouTube, but in my feed it doesn't show as a video thumbnail. So I'm not sure whether or not you have been sort of reminded that there is this live feed. So let me know if you have seen my live announcement of my live feed before it actually went live here at 2 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time +1, which is winter time in Denmark. So I suppose that if you're living in the USA, you're probably not, I wouldn't say not alive, but you're possibly not awakened yet. You would something like, it would be early morning or something for you, and maybe you are fresh out of bed and think this could be interesting. Otherwise, I'm not sure how to approach this live thing. It seems that there are at least one more viewer on, so I'm happy to. I would appreciate if you get on, if you are watching this, please leave a comment. So I actually know there's somebody out there listening to me. That would be nice. So let me have some questions or something like that. If you have a question or something you want me to elaborate on, or any of the recent videos or comments, or something that I screwed up completely or whatever, give me a note and I'll discuss it. We'll discuss it. You can even get a link to join in on the video. You can get a link to, so you can appear on the show if you want to go on live here. So I hopefully I can get it to work. I think so. I think I'm that able, right? So, but otherwise, if you are listening in here, please give me a comment and let me know you're here, or throw me a question or two, right? Otherwise, I will spend some time to not just to sit here and look stupid, but I will talk about Hume's is-ought gap, which was something that I mentioned recently in a video where I commented on Stefan Molyneux's approach to the Hume's is-ought gap, which I got around it pretty well, but I thought there was maybe a few things that could need a bit more clarification. So I just send in a comment here. So Hume's is-ought gap is in many ways something that has been, I have followed this. Whenever I see somebody mention Hume's is-ought gap, I'm sort of, holding my ears, or whatever it's called, right? I listen carefully and try to figure out if there's some other of how people approach this idea of the is-ought gap, right? And it seems to me that most people, if not everybody, there's nobody who has clearly said anything else. But if they say something, it might be either what I'm going to say just here in a few seconds, or it's so fluffy that I'm not really sure what they're saying. But what I'm hearing people say is you cannot get an ought from an is, right? You cannot get an ought from an is. That's how it is seemingly perceived by everybody, right? That I've heard of. And that goes for Stefan Molyneux also, right? So it's interesting to understand. But the good thing about a guy like Hume is we have his books, and it's also in English, which is not necessarily important that it's that language, but at least that's a language that most people in the world, all else equal, have a good chance of understanding, even if it was written almost 300 years ago. When you read the quote, I think it's slightly changed from the original text. It's slightly optimized for modern English, but it's not very much, right? It's basically the same text here, right? So I haven't found the original first edition, whatever. So I don't know even if there might be a scan or a PDF of the original first edition. Could actually be interesting to see if it's exactly the same quote, right? But it has, for some reason, it has been perceived or understood or interpreted as if you cannot get an ought from an is. Maybe it's those who are analyzing Hume's is-ought gap who are saying, well, I can't figure it out, so it must be impossible. Or they have just heard what other people are talking about, and they're saying you can't get an ought from an is. So they just accept that must be what Hume is talking about. Even when they read the quote, they sort of, yeah, and it's imperceptible. Okay, you can't get an ought from an is. It can't receive provision found merely on relations between objects. Okay, I guess you can't get an ought from an is, right? And at the same time, people seem to be, well, how can I get an ought from an is anyway? So it's like people are saying, yeah, Hume says you can't get an ought from is, but I need an ought from is, or I need an ought at least, so I guess I have to get it from the is. So I'm trying to find some way to get from an is to an ought, right? And I'm of the conviction that I think it's a good idea to go back and look at what Hume was actually stating, right? I mean, it's like, that's where I want to go, right? I mean, it's like that's what the quote is. You can't, you shouldn't go with an interpretation if you have the source, the source code of, so to say, right? What's the word? If you have the exact quote that things seems to be based on, right? So why don't people go back and read the quote? And to the best of my understanding, this thing about you can't get an ought from an is exactly or very clearly, to me at least, a misinterpretation of what Hume is saying. So it's like there's a problem here of some kind, right? So I'm not sure, I can't tell you why other people seem to be thinking that you can't get an ought from an is, and then they have to establish that ought somehow, and how they approach this sort of cognitive dissonance. So I can only speak for myself, and I was kind of surprised, because I was probably in the first camp of, I guess you can't get an ought from an is. I'm just trusting that when people say that Hume said that you can't get an ought from an is, that's what it says in a quote. But when I sort of, deconstruct the quote, what he's saying is, it's not that you can't get an ought from an is. He doesn't say you can get it, right? But it doesn't say you can't get it either, right? It's actually in a sense, it's quite limited what he's actually claiming about what you can or what you can't, right? He's basically just telling you or asking you or begging you possibly, to be very careful about how you argue for morality. His book, A Treatise of Human Nature, is a book about morality, right? Now, I don't agree with Hume's understanding of morality or ethics when he gets further down the line. I don't agree with him, at least not in all aspects, right? But that's not important for this kind of discussion here. But at least what he gets at is a common ridiculous way of arguing, right? Which is basically saying something like, well, when it's people are talking, arguing, making first of all statements which basically are just some kind of description or reference to something that exists, a reference to reality, what is, right? Is and ought, right? And then suddenly they start to say, therefore you should or shouldn't do, right? It's like there's no bit in their argumentation between these is and oughts, so to say. These descriptions of reality is not followed by some kind of bit that explains why now I'm going into making sort of categorical imperatives. I'm saying, therefore you should or shouldn't do, right? And this sort of all of a sudden switch to commandments, Hume says, well, I'm not going to accept that, right? Because it's like, where do these commandments, why have they any connection at all with these statements about how the world is, right? And the point is, people are not saying this is the case, this is not the case, this is the case, this is not the case, and then ought not, right? That's what you have to read. You have to understand what he's trying to say, right? He's basically saying there are descriptions over here which are about what exists, right? There's nothing about, there's no commandments that they're pointing to, right? There's no empirical observations of oughts or anything like that, or any description or argument that is connected with an ought, which is the term that he uses. We are going into the quote later here, right? And then these parts over here where they say, well, therefore you ought or ought not, ought and ought not. There's nothing that connects them. It's like apples and oranges, right? You could say they're both fruit, but if you get my drift, like they're apples and bicycles all of a sudden, right? What's the connection? Why are you just switching over to talking about bicycles when you were talking about apples? It's sort of the same east-west, black-white, complete disconnection, right? And because it's disconnected, it's sort of, why is it there or at all? Why are these statements about reality? Why don't you just say, you ought to do this, you ought not do that, you ought to do that, you should not do this, or whatever, right? Why are you putting these descriptions of reality in front of these commandments, which have no connection to these statements about reality? They're sort of superfluous. Get rid of them, right? And then what's left is do this, do that. But I guess that what people, when they argue like that, it's like you have to have a reference to why you are making these commandments, right? So what you have is a description of your experiences, and your experiences is your empirical whatever, right? And these are the references to existence and behavior maybe also, right? But actions but actions are performed on objects that has existence, and these are the ises, right? So it's sort of he is pointing to a sophist trick that people use, is that they put this in front of their commandments to sort of make it look like they're actually arguing for why these commandments should be there, right? So that, of course, there will probably some kind of connection at you did this with that knife to that object, and therefore you shouldn't use knives or something like that, right? So yes, they mentioned a knife there, and or on the outside there were also knives mentioned, sort of, right? So it's not completely disconnected, possibly, but that's why he is talking about oughts, that the argument over on the ought side is connected with an ought, right? It's almost as if it's the same kind of lingo, but just with oughts added to it, to some extent at least, right? And this is sort of a strange way of arguing. But the important point to understand, in my opinion, is that when you deconstruct, whenever you listen to people making statements about how you should or shouldn't act, which you could say is a kind of moral statement, Hume doesn't say that it's a moral statement. But when you deconstruct statements, morality always ends up being some kind of adjustment of behavior, and that's sort of the ought or ought not, right? So it's whenever people talk about you should or shouldn't do this, right? There's always some explanation or reference or description, something, before they get to say these, right? They don't just, say, do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that, right? Maybe parents do that to their children because they think children are stupid, right? But when they're, in sort of in everyday argumentation and discussions and so on, it's like, well, I observed this, and that's wrong, wrong. It has wrongness to it, therefore you shouldn't, right? Now, when they say it's wrong, that's because they already have some kind of preconceived idea about an experience that is good or bad. I don't think necessarily Hume is talking about that. It might be, but the distinction here is more sharp with descriptions of reality all of a sudden switching over to commandments. That's my interpretation, at least, right? So what I am hearing Hume says, or between the lines, is that people actually stick these ises and oughts statements in front of their commandment in order to make people think that it validates these ought statements, right? But Hume just points out you can't argue this way. You can try, and maybe people have gotten away with it for thousands of years, so it works, right? It's working, but it's not good philosophy, right? So as a good philosopher, he's pointing out there's something missing here, or something is wrong, right? So let's take the quote. So he starts out by saying, in every system of morality which I've hitherto met with, I've always remarked that the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary way of reasoning and establishes the being of a god, or makes observations concerning human affairs, when of a sudden I'm surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought and ought not, right? So I guess you have to, clarify a bit what he's possibly trying to say. That it's quite clear, in my opinion, that it's is, and then ought, right? To cut it very basic, right? So it's a very sort of loose kind of, well, he's sort of his general experience of how people argue, both those who are writing books, but also, people, everyday argumentation, right? And he refers to, arguing for the existence of a God and, human affairs and so on, how people act. So you can say there's a reference to actions, right? Existence of gods, human affairs, which are actions, and then things that exist. So you see, he's broad. Maybe I'm right, not quite correct if I say that he doesn't refer to actions. He actually does when he says human affairs. So that's sort of a point I have, maybe skipped over a bit too quickly. But it's not very hard to understand, in my opinion, what he's trying to say, right? They describe something that exists somewhere or another, has a reference to existence, right? And then all of a sudden switching over to something that is not connected with an or not. And the important thing to observe is he's used the term connected with an or, which is another way of saying or is a term he uses as a placeholder or a general description of anything that has commandment to it or morality to it or anything along those lines, right? He's not saying morality, but when people moralize, it's generally telling people what to do, right? So it's sort of maybe a sort of a gray area whether or not he's talking directly about moral statements or it's just you should because whatever, right? But it's the distinction between, it's the sudden switch, right? It's the sudden switch from descriptions of reality, so to say, then all of a sudden switching into telling people what to do, right? There may be something, it may be a valid approach if you can point out how you get to make this leap, right? You can't just make the leap and pretend you don't need to explain the leap, right? Maybe you can make the leap, right? But then you have to explain how you do that. You can't just talk about apples and then all of a sudden switch into talk about bicycles, right? Why are you? What's happening, right? Why this jump, right? And it's different categories. Descriptions of reality is different from a commandment about how people should act. It's completely different, right? The only indirect connection could be the objects involved in those descriptions and those commandments. If it's about a knife over here on the is side, and then a claim about an ought involves how to use a knife or something like that. Okay, the knife is the only common denominator, but then the rest of it is just completely on two different planets, right? So even if both reference knife, it doesn't bring anything to the situation or to the philosophy other than knife on both sides, right? And that doesn't enlighten anyone. Okay, so then he says, this change is imperceptible, but is, however, of the last consequence. For as this ought or ought not expresses some new relation or affirmation, it's necessary that it should be observed and explained that at the same time that a reason should be given for what seems altogether inconceivable, how this new relation can be deduction from others, which are entirely different from it. Well, he says, how could it be a deduction, right? I'm not even sure that people think that it's a deduction, but if they just say is, all of a sudden say ought, it's obviously that there is no deduction. If there is a deduction, it's something going on inside people that makes them think that they are in their philosophical right to start to say or deal out commandments. So whether or not you can call it a deduction, well, it's up for discussion, possibly, right? But he says this change is imperceptible, and I think, it's a little fluffy what it could possibly mean, right? It could be several things he is referring to. It could be the linguistic part, that there is nothing to perceive in I can't hear anything in how these people argue that could point to why they make this leap or this jump or jump this gap, right? It's imperceptible. I can't perceive anything in the argument that would justify labeling it as sort of a description of a gap or a clarification of how this gap is jumped and so on, right? It could also be a reference to whatever it might be they are talking about on the is side is nothing that can be experienced, right? What they're possibly referring to, which becomes commandments, can't be something that can be perceived. It's imperceptible over on this side, right? So, but he's talking about the change. So the change, if you're on an is side, there must be something that is related to is's to connect them with the odds, so to say, right? So some part of this gap that must be bridged, if you want to argue this way, must be perceivable. Otherwise, everything is on the odd side. So that disconnects, right, the is and the odd. So if you're making the jump, there must be at least some part of the connection between them that is actually perceptible. And he states that, well, it's imperceptible. There's nothing, neither in what they say or what I could possibly experience in the reference to what is being talked about, that is perceptible. So I can't see anything. I can't see anything that could justify jumping the gap. So it's like, and it's of the last consequence. It's like, well, if it's not there, you don't have an argument, basically, right? Of the last consequence, it's like, okay, it needs to be there. If you want to argue this way, you need to point out how you connect the is with the odd, right? So he doesn't say it's the only way you can argue. You have to bridge the is and odd gap. He doesn't say that. He's just pointing out people are arguing without even pointing out or not even identifying the flaw in the row of their argumentation. And that's what he says. You need to add something that explains how you make that jump. That's all, right? He says, for as this ought not expresses some new relation or affirmation, it's necessary that it should be observed and explained. And at the same time, that a reason should be given for what seems altogether inconceivable. How this new relation can be deducted from others which are entirely different from it. Yes, it's inconceivable to him how you could possibly argue from something that is to a commandment, right? So, maybe he's not talking about commandments, but that's my interpretation. I'll have to clarify that, right? So, in his opinion, they're completely entirely different, right? Is statements are entirely different from commandments, categorical imperatives or whatever, right? Ought. And you have to explain how you make this. Otherwise, he says you should not take this seriously. It's bullshit, right? Which I agree with, right? And it's also this, if there's no connection between the is statements and the ought statements, why don't you just stick with the ought statements and go around telling people what to do? But that doesn't sound like you're arguing, right? Then you're just, shoving people around. But if you put these descriptions of reality in front of it, it seems like there's a connection, right? So therefore, it ends up sounding like an argument, which is actually not there. And the point is, as Hume also says, that when you take the precaution of just analyzing this jump, you will see that every morality in the history of the world basically commits this fallacy, right? Every moral argument in the history of moral arguments makes this. It says in the book, therefore you shouldn't do. Well, a book is a description of some letters and some pages and paper, and it is or is not. Well, therefore you should. It's not a good argument, right? So it's like it's important to not go further with Hume than you need to, right? And welcome to my 3 viewers. Please, this is an Ask Me Anything. So, okay, then two viewers just suddenly disappeared. I'm not trying to frighten you or anything, but it's an Ask Me Anything, an AMA. So please, if you have any questions, please leave a question, or if you want to join the video here, please. But it's just not to sit and look stupid that I'm talking about Hume's is-ought gap. So if you have anything you want to discuss, let me have a comment in there should be a comment field at the right portion of your screen. So so this is my sort of my run through of Hume, right? And it's maybe it's a problem that I mean, Hume couldn't foresee that, right? Hume couldn't foresee that this sort of side note at the end of a section in his book, when he sort of gears up to talk about morality, would be misinterpreted or taken too far by those who read it and those who sort of present it to others. So it has become, you can't get an ought from an is, which is completely misinterpretation of what it says, in my opinion. And that's it's also of the last consequence, right? Because if he says you can't get an ought from an is, well, just because Hume says it, it doesn't mean that it's not a law, as people call it. It's not Hume's law. It's like, this is how it is. Fuck you, right? That's not how you should approach philosophy. Everything is up for discussion. Everything is up for change. Everything, you should be skeptical about everything, right? In my opinion. Don't take anything for granted. And that's why it's also important to, read Hume instead of just, going with what somebody else says, right? Make your own judgment, make your own interpretation of what it says. Don't listen to my interpretation. Don't listen, but don't just eat it raw, right? Be inspired to go and make your own judgment. And I would be happy to watch your video where you explain you'll change my mind and say, well, I missed something, right? But I mean, it's quite clear to me that he doesn't say that you can't get an ought from an is. He says it's inconceivable, right? It's imperceptible and all this. So you can discuss then what does he actually mean when he's using these words imperceptible and inconceivable. But when you say you can't conceive of something, it doesn't mean you are saying it's impossible. This is also a fallacious way of understanding it. Inconceivable is not the same as impossible. It's actually very different from it, right? That I can't conceive how to, if I was sitting back in Hume's day and wondering, could you human being possibly fly from England to New York, right? Could it be possible? I mean, if I was Hume, I would say it's inconceivable to me how you would possibly do that, right? If you had a very large tower and could fall, like a squirrel, maybe you could fall to New York, but then you will die in the fall or something, right? So yeah, I guess it's not, I can't rule out that it's possible, but it's completely inconceivable to me, right? That's what, Hume would possibly say, right? And that's why it says it's inconceivable, because there's no way he can argue for why it would be impossible, right? And it's also a very good way of presenting philosophy in this context he's using it. It's saying, be aware of this kind of argumentation. Be a good philosopher. Describe how you get from the is to the ought. That's basically what he's saying, right? It's just present the way a good argument for. Don't just talk about is and then all of a sudden command people around. It doesn't work. It's a stupid argument, right? And I would completely agree with that. I mean, and the point is not that. The point is that you have to understand on a meta level, you could say, what he's talking about, the categories of his argument, that's the is and the oughts. But if people are not talking about is, that doesn't mean that they can get to say oughts, right? Or if they're not saying oughts over here, that means they have bridged the gap or something like that. There's nothing magical about the term is or the term ought, which is something that Stefan Molyneux also tries to use as a way of arguing against Hume, right? Which is all sorts of sophist. And it's, how should I put it? Be careful not to take words too seriously. Get an idea of what you're talking about. It's not the words that directs your philosophy. It's your philosophy that should direct your words, right? there should be some philosophy, the thinking that you stick your terms on. And that's why he says, for instance, connected with an ought or an ought not, right? He clearly states that I don't mean ought as an important word, but I mean all kinds of statements that are connected with an ought, right? Which is sort of these commandments I'm talking about. And maybe you can extend it, not only arguments, but other things, right? And it's just something that you need to handle, right? I mean, my personal idea is it's inconceivable to me how you could argue for morality other ways than through an is ought, right? I can see how you would argue from is or argue for morality without needing to jump this gap or explain the jump so you can explain the gap so you can jump it, right? In my opinion, I can't conceive of any, but I'm not saying it's impossible, just like I should be as skeptical as humans, right? That I can see how you would otherwise be able to argue, because it's always some kind of experience that gives you a sense of moral or immoral without being able to express it exactly what it is that makes you feel or think of that morality. And it's that sort of, it has, it goes into yourself and you have some moral feelings or whatever you want to call it, and then it comes out as commandments. But what other people are hearing are just the is statements and the ought statements. They are not a part of that, what went through you that created your commandments, or you're saying you should or shouldn't do that. So, and I'm also guilty of that. I mean, in a recent video where I had a communication with my doctor about the situation of the sickness at the moment, I also said that I felt this is kind of immoral, but I can't point to that. There's a gap missing, but the gap is sort of inside me somehow, right? The gap is inside me that connects the is with the ought. And that's what I have to present, right? And I have to present it in a way so that other people can understand what I'm saying, and they can identify the same string of emotions or whatever it is that goes on in them, so that they arrive at a sort of a commandment or something like that, right? I'm not just saying commandment, but it could be framed another way, maybe, right? So at that point, it's always this. It's like, but it's just your opinion, right? And it is. If it's not connected, if you can't express that emotion you have when you go from the is to the ought, it's just your opinion, right? I can't refer to anything. There has to be something there described so we can agree upon it. Otherwise, you are not connecting the is and the oughts. Personally, I would never be able to argue any other way from morality than from an is to an ought, right? Because it's always some kind of situation in reality which is deemed as moral or immoral, no matter how it's arrived at, right? Whenever people are referring to some oughts, it's always because of something that's in reality. So I'm not saying it's not based on reality, and Hume doesn't say that either. But it's the gap between them. It's the jump. It's the why does it follow, right? Why am I able to say is or is not over here? And if it's through me as a subject, nobody else is experiencing that part of that, chain of arguments and emotions and whatever it is, right? So that is what has to be agreed upon, right? That's the closest I can get to an explanation of how I will approach it. So hopefully I will, whenever I get finished with my book about ethics, or actually my treatise on philosophy, you could say, right? It will be clear how to do it, but I'm still working on it, right? So I have some ideas. Let me put it that way. Okay. If anybody watching would like me to discuss anything about philosophy, let me have your question. Anything. Otherwise, it will the transmission will end quite soon, because Hume says was all I had as a backup plan so far. Okay, so there's one person watching. So if you want me to answer your question, please let me know. Write a comment. Maybe write a comment below the video if there's no comment area over here on that side over there. If I screwed up something and you say, yeah, you asked me to write some comments and I can't write the comments, so explain how things looks from your side. There should be some comment area over here, over there, right? So this is sort of the end of the video. If nobody has any questions, I would love to take questions. I'm not going to ridicule you or anything. I'll do my best to be a nice, friendly philosopher. Okay, I guess that's it. It doesn't seem like anyone or that lonely person watching wants, or maybe that one is me actually. That's myself I'm talking to. Apparently, live. I'm the only one watching myself. It's slightly confusing how it works on YouTube. It's just I had to get used to it, right? So now I can see I'm actually the only one. So I'm going to end this transmission, and maybe I will set up another live transmission at another point. Maybe people will come by and watch this and say, I was not, can we do it at another point of time and another time of day or in the evenings and whatever. It's just like at this point in time in Scandinavia, it gets dark at around 4 o'clock, something like that, right? So I like to have, daylight when I do it. I don't have, big, lighting thing to keep it interesting in the picture frame here, right? If I was recording at night. So, but maybe I can figure something out, right? So, okay, so there was a little comment there. What's that? Adelfo Miral, hvor er fyld? You have to, I don't know if that's some kind of hacking or, whatever it is. I don't understand this. I think I'm going to hide that again. So if that's the only question, I think I'm going to block that user. Right? Doesn't sound like a serious question. Otherwise, comment on it down below in the comment section below here if you want to comment on how to approach live transmissions in the future, if it's something that my 192 subs want to use as a kind of platform, right? It could be fun, right? So otherwise, have a nice day and Happy New Year whenever you Merry New Year. Until we if we do not see each other until next year. Bye bye.